There are kisses that taste of love, but there are others that taste of survival. In the port city of Oakhaven, where skyscrapers of glass and steel strain to touch the heavens, while casting long shadows over sin-drenched alleys, there is an unwritten law everyone knows by heart. Never cross Silas Vane. He is more than a man. He is the ghost who dictates the city's pulse from the lonely heights of his Cloud Peak manor. Elara Thorne had spent 24 years of her life trying to remain invisible. An architect with dreams etched in blueprints, she was a prisoner of reality, trapped by the frantic, suffocating control of Adrian Sterling. Adrian loved her the way a hunter loves prey, caught in a snare, with violence, with bruises hidden beneath expensive silk, and with a fear that seeped into her every breath. Tonight, within the Celestial Hotel, amidst the shimmer of crystal chandeliers and the swell of symphonic music, Elara knew she was standing on the precipice of death. Adrian's last shred of patience had snapped. He intended to destroy her before she could ever find the strength to run. In that moment of absolute desperation, with her heart battering against her ribs like a strangled bird, she saw him, Silas Vane, the man with eyes the colour of cold ash, the only one capable of obliterating Adrian with a single nod. Elara didn't need a saviour. She needed a demon powerful enough to subdue the monster haunting her. And so, she made a choice of pure madness. She walked straight towards Silas and pressed her lips to his. A kiss of betrayal, a kiss of covenant, a kiss that would rewrite the destiny of Oakhaven forever. If this kiss cannot save me, at least let me die in the arms of the most powerful man on earth. The story of redemption, vengeance, and a love born from the ashes begins now. Here is the professional English translation of the super extended version of Oakhaven Forever. If this kiss cannot save me, at least let me die in the arms of the most powerful man on earth. The story of redemption, vengeance, and a love born from the ashes begins now. Tonight, the city of Oakhaven donned a cloak of magnificent lies. From the rooftop of the Celestial Hotel, one could behold a panoramic view of the metropolis, its neon lights sparkling like shards of diamonds scattered across a black velvet rug. But to Elara Thorne, those lights felt like thousands of watchful eyes, guarding her movements and keeping her imprisoned. Inside the grand ballroom, the space was so radiant it was blinding. Massive crystal chandeliers, weighing tons, hung suspended from the ceiling, reflecting light onto evening gowns worth tens of thousands of dollars and meticulously tailored suits. The symphonic orchestra played a soft, elegant melody, but to Elara it sounded like a funeral bell tolling with rhythmic precision. Smile, Elara. Don't make me remind you again. Adrian Sterling's voice hissed in her ear, sweet as honey, but dripping with lethal venom. He was squeezing her waist, his fingers pressing hard into the fragile flesh, where a deep purple bruise from last night's fury had yet to fade. Elara stifled a whimper, her trembling lips forced into a mechanical, hollow smile. She caught a glimpse of herself in a large gilded mirror. The woman reflected back was undeniably beautiful in her forest green silk gown, but her eyes had been dead for a long time. For 2 years, Elara had learned to be the perfect doll for Adrian, a young heir with the face of a prince and the soul of an executioner. He loved her the way a cruel child loves a favorite toy, by breaking it to ensure it can never crawl away. "Congressman, it is an absolute honor to meet you," Adrian said with a beaming face, shaking the hand of a stout, balding man while his other hand remained clamped onto Elara like a brand. Elara stood there, feeling a wave of humiliation wash over her. She was an architect, someone who had once dreamt of building unshakable towers for this city. Yet now, she couldn't even construct an exit for herself. Every time she tried to flee, Adrian found her. He had the money, the power, and the filthy connections that ensured every door of justice remained slammed in her face. Suddenly, the air in the room shifted. A cold but authoritative current swept through the ballroom. The boisterous laughter died down, replaced by whispers of reverent awe. Silas Vane had entered. He didn't walk like a guest. He walked like a master inspecting his domain. Silas eschewed the shiny tuxedos of the elite. He chose a minimalist pitch-black suit, but his aura radiated a raw, primal power. His ash-grey eyes were as deep and cold as a frozen lake, lingering on no one, as if no soul in the room was worthy of his attention. In Oakhaven, Silas Vane was a name only whispered. He was the uncrowned king, the man who held the city's economic jugular. The smart avoided him, the greedy tried to cling to him. Adrian Sterling was the latter. He released Elara's waist, his eyes lighting up like he'd struck gold. "Silas Vane is here. This is our chance, Elara. If I get his signature for the Eastport project, the Sterling family will have no rivals." Adrian adjusted his tie nervously. "Stay right here, don't cause trouble, or tonight you'll be left with more than just bruises." Adrian hurried into the crowd swarming Silas. Elara remained alone, a solitary island in a sea of strangers. She looked at her trembling hands. A mad, suicidal yet seductive thought ignited in her mind. She knew the rumors about Silas Vane. He was ruthless, cold, and he despised Adrian Sterling. The Vane and Sterling families were the two opposing poles of Oakhaven. Silas viewed Adrian as a cowardly petty thief hiding in his father's shadow. "If I fall into Silas's hands, I might die, but at least Adrian will never dare touch me again," Elara thought. It was a trade-off between two types of demons, one who tortured her daily and one who could end her in an instant. She chose the stronger one. Elara began to walk. Her steps were unsteady on her expensive heels. She navigated past socialites flaunting their jewels and men debating politics. The faint scent of jasmine from her skin parted the path through the cloying, fake fragrances in the room. Silas Vane stood there, surrounded by sycophants. He looked profoundly lonely amidst the crowd, a loneliness defined by sheer power. When Elara was only a few steps away, Calum, Silas's head of security, stepped forward to intercept. But Silas had already seen her. His ash-grey gaze locked onto Elara. He saw the sheer terror in her eyes, but beneath that terror was a dying ember of determination. He saw the tiny bruises on her neck that her foundation had failed to conceal. "Stand down, Calum," Silas commanded, his voice low and vibrating like distant thunder. The crowd instinctively parted, creating a silent circle around the two. Adrian Sterling saw it then. He froze in his tracks, unable to comprehend what Elara was doing. Elara stood before Silas. He towered over her, radiating the scent of sandalwood and the chill of authority. She clung to the lapels of his coat, feeling the premium fabric beneath her fingers. "Help me escape him," she whispered, her breath hitching. "I will be whatever you want. A tool, a hostage, a shadow. Just save me from that hell." Silas narrowed his eyes. He was not a man prone to charity. He was a businessman, and every transaction required a profit. "My price is very steep, Elara Thorne," Silas replied, calling her by her name for the first time. "I have nothing left to lose," Elara said, and before Silas could react, she rose on her tiptoes. The kiss was an electric shock. Elara pressed her lips against Silas's in front of the entirety of Oakhaven's elite. It was not a kiss of lovers. It was a plea, a covenant, written in desperation. Silas stiffened. For a split second he intended to cast her aside and leave her to her fate, but then he felt the heat of her tears falling onto his cheek. He felt her body racking with tremors as he saw Adrian charging toward them. Silas Vane hated weakness, but he hated Adrian Sterling more. And there was something about this woman, this suicidal courage, that stimulated his instinct for possession. He wound his arm around her waist, squeezing so tightly Elara thought her ribs might snap. He did not push her away. Instead, he leaned down and returned the kiss with a ferocity that terrified everyone in the room. It was a declaration of war. "Elara, what the hell are you doing?" Adrian roared, charging forward, his face distorted with humiliation. "Mr. Vane, let her go. She is my fiancée." Silas broke the kiss, but his arm remained locked around Elara's waist, pulling her firmly behind his back. He looked at Adrian, as if looking at an insect beneath his boot. "Fiancée?" Silas let out a dry, chilling laugh that made Adrian recoil. "I see only a woman pleading for help from abuse. These wounds—" Silas lifted Elara's wrist, exposing the dark bruises to the gawking crowd. "Is the Sterling family so wealthy they must use their fists to keep a woman?" The room erupted in murmurs. Contemptuous glances began to turn toward Adrian. "Mr. Vane, this is a misunderstanding." "Get out, Sterling," Silas interrupted, his voice like shards of ice. "Before I decide to go public with your tax records and those unidentified shipments your family has at the Oakhaven port. From this moment on, Elara Thorne belongs to Cloud Peak Manor. She is no longer your fiancée. She is my debt." Adrian Sterling stood rooted to the spot, his hands clenched so hard they bled, but he didn't dare take a single step forward. He knew that opposing Silas Vane was a death sentence. Silas led Elara out of the ballroom. Every step he took was full of authority, forcing the crowd to part like the Red Sea. As they stepped into the obsidian limousine waiting outside, Elara felt as if she had just escaped a fire only to enter a darker cave. In the quiet, luxurious cabin of the car, Silas looked at the woman huddling beside him. He wiped a trace of lipstick from the corner of his mouth, his grey eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "You just made the biggest gamble of your life, Elara," Silas said, his voice deep and gravelly. "I have saved you from hell, but you should know that the devil never works for free." Elara looked out the window as the lights of Oakhaven blurred past. She was exhausted and in pain, but for the first time in 2 years, she was no longer afraid of Adrian Sterling. "I know," she whispered, "and I am ready to pay." The car sped into the night, heading toward the highest tower in the city, where Silas Vane would show her that his protection was sometimes heavier than any chain. The obsidian limousine glided silently through the neon-drenched streets of Oakhaven, but inside the cabin, the silence was so thick and suffocating that Elara could hear the frantic rhythm of her own heart. She huddled in the corner of the luxurious leather seat, her hands tightly interlaced to hide a tremor that refused to subside. Beside her, Silas Vane leaned back into the shadows. He didn't look at her. His ash-grey gaze remained fixed on the towering glass monoliths passing by the window. His presence exuded a natural sovereignty, a heavy, invisible pressure that seemed to thin the very air in the car. "Are you afraid?" Silas spoke suddenly, his deep voice shattering the stillness. Elara startled. She looked up at him, her lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came out. He turned to face her, his sharp eyes locking onto her pale features. You dared to kiss me in front of the entire city to find a lifeline, he said. Does your courage vanish so quickly? I just didn't think I would actually get away, Elara whispered, her voice raw. Thank you for taking me with you. Silas curled his lip into a cold, mocking smirk. Don't be so quick to thank me. Adrian Sterling is a cruel man, but he is a cruelty you understand. But me, you have no idea where you are going. The car came to a halt at the private entrance of the Vane Empire Tower, the tallest building in Oakhaven. The door opened and a gust of biting night air rushed in, though it was not as cold as the gazes of the guards who bowed their heads as Silas emerged. He stepped out without waiting, but his long strides paused after a few paces. A silent, commanding invitation. Elara hurried after him, feeling as though she were walking into the mouth of a titan made of steel and glass. The private elevator shot them directly to the top floor, to the place known as Cloud Peak Manor. When the doors slid open, Elara was utterly overwhelmed. It was not merely an apartment, it was a fortress suspended in the sky. The entire eastern and southern walls were made of floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass, offering a breathtaking view of the sprawling city below. From this height, the streaks of traffic looked like rivers of red and white blood flowing through the city's veins. The interior was minimalist, dominated by tones of obsidian and quartz grey, chilly, yet radiating an aura of supreme luxury. "Welcome to Cloud Peak, Miss Thorne," a warm voice greeted. A middle-aged woman with silver hair tucked into a neat bun stepped forward, dressed in a pristine housekeeper's uniform. This was Martha. Her eyes lingered on the bruises blooming across Elara's neck and wrists, a flicker of sorrow crossing her otherwise stoic face. "Martha, prepare the VIP suite in the West Wing," Silas commanded, shedding his overcoat and handing it to Kylam. "And call the family physician. I don't want my guest looking like a broken toy." "Right away, Mr. Vane." Elara stood frozen in the vast living room. Silas walked toward the bar and poured himself a glass of neat scotch. The neon lights of the city cast long, lonely shadows across his frame. "Mr. Vane, may I ask you something?" Elara gathered her courage. Silas turned, the amber liquid swirling in his glass. "Speak. Why did you help me? I know you despise Adrian, but this will start a war between the Sterling and Vane families. I didn't think a kiss was worth that much." Silas set the glass down and walked toward her with slow, measured steps. Each footfall on the quartz floor echoed like a sharp crack in the silence. When he stood before her, Elara felt as small as a leaf before a hurricane. He leaned down, closing the gap until she could smell the sandalwood and feel the radiating heat of his body. "You're right. A kiss isn't worth that much," Silas whispered, his finger hooked under her chin, forcing her to look into his dangerous, ash-grey eyes. "But your defiance was. Adrian Sterling prides himself on being able to domesticate anything he wants, seeing his favourite plaything personally destroy his reputation in public. That was a performance I was more than willing to pay for." He paused, his gaze grazing Elara's trembling lips. "And there is another reason. You are an architect, Elara. I have seen your blueprints for the East Oakhaven redevelopment project. An intellect like yours shouldn't be buried under the fists of an incompetent man like Sterling. You are a potential asset, and Silas Vane never ignores a good asset." Elara was stunned. He knew about her career. He knew about the blueprints that Adrian had torn to shreds and called trash. "Now, follow Martha, bathe, heal your wounds, and sleep. Tomorrow, we will discuss your protection fee." As Elara was led away by Martha, she glanced back. Silas Vane remained there, his back to her, staring out at the vast city. He looked like a king holding the world in his hands, but also like a prisoner of his own greatness. Martha led Elara to a massive suite in the West Wing. The room was beautiful to the point of being surreal, featuring a king-size bed draped in soft silk and a sunken bathtub that overlooked the starlit sky. Martha gently helped Elara undress, removing the forest green silk that was stained with the residue of terror. As the silk fell away, the bruises on Elara's body were laid bare, vivid marks of the frantic obsession Adrian had left behind. Martha let out a soft, pained breath as she took up ointments and bandages, meticulously tending to each wound. "Don't be afraid, little miss," Martha said softly. "In Cloud Peak, Mr. Silas is the law. No one can touch you unless he permits it. He may be cold, but he is a man of his word." Elara lay in the warm bath, the final tears of resentment falling silently into the water. She had escaped Adrian's hell, but was Cloud Peak truly heaven? Or had she simply traded iron shackles for ones made of solid gold? In the dead of night, while Oakhaven slept fitfully, Silas Vane sat in his office. On a large monitor was Elara Thorne's personal file. He scrolled through her academic excellence, her architectural awards, and a photo of her smiling brightly at her graduation, a smile that Adrian Sterling had extinguished for 2 long years. Calum knocked and entered, his face grim. "Sir, Adrian Sterling is frantically pulling strings to pressure us. He's even made contact with several underground groups at the South Port." Silas swiveled his chair slightly, his gaze cold as Arctic ice. "Let him try. The more he struggles, the more he exposes his flank. Tell our people to tighten the surveillance on the Sterling family's shipments. I want Adrian Sterling to realize by Monday morning that losing a woman was only the beginning of losing an empire." "Understood, sir. And Miss Thorne?" Silas fell silent for a moment, recalling the feel of her trembling lips on his tonight. A kiss full of desperation, yet burning with fire. "Keep her at Cloud Peak. Do not let her contact anyone on the outside. I need her mind clear enough to realize that from now on, her life no longer belongs to God. It belongs to me." That night, in the luxurious room in the West Wing, Elara Thorne fell into a dreamless sleep. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't have to wake in the night to the sound of an angry door being kicked or the stench of alcohol. But in the quiet expanse of Cloud Peak, she could still hear the wind whistling against the glass. A mournful sound, like a warning that freedom always comes with a heavy price. And Silas Vane was never a man to lose on a deal. The morning sun of Oakhaven was not gentle like that of the countryside. It was harsh and jagged, reflecting off the glass skyscrapers and pouring into Elara's bedroom like a reminder that the world continued to turn, even though her life had just experienced a tectonic shift. Elara woke up on a layer of soft down feathers, her body feeling strangely light. The wounds on her wrists and shoulders had been treated with ointment. The searing pain of the previous night had faded into a dull, lingering ache. She sat up, looking around the opulent room. Everything here was too perfect, so much so that she felt like a flawed stroke on a master architect's blueprint. A soft knock sounded at the door, and Martha entered with a lavish breakfast tray and a new set of clothes, minimalist in design but exquisitely tailored. "Good morning, Miss Thorne. Mr. Silas is waiting for you in the north study once you have finished your meal," Martha said, her smile remaining calm and maternal. He seems very busy, doesn't he?" Elara asked, her fingers nervously grazing the silk of her robe. "He is always busy running this city, miss. But this morning, he cancelled 2 board meetings just to wait for you." Martha's words made the bread in Elara's mouth difficult to swallow. Cancelled meetings for her? Silas Vane was not the type of man to waste time on trivialities. That could only mean one thing. The price she had to pay was about to be determined. 15 minutes later, Elara walked along the long corridor of Cloud Peak Manor. The expensive, abstract paintings on the walls seemed to watch her every trembling step. As she entered the North Study, she saw Silas standing before a massive digital map of Oakhaven. The blue light from the screen cast shadows across his angular face, making him look like a grand architect manipulating chess pieces on a giant board. He did not turn around, but his deep, gravelly voice resonated the moment her feet touched the carpet. "Did you sleep well, Elara?" "Thank you. It has been a long time since I've had such a quiet sleep." Silas turned around, holding a thick file. He stepped toward her, his ash-grey eyes quickly scanning the bandages on her body. He placed the file on the ebony desk. "This is a list of the assets Adrian Sterling has seized from you over the past 2 years. My legal office has begun the recovery process, but that is not why I called you here." He activated a detailed planning map on the screen. It was the East End slums, the place where Elara had poured her heart into a redevelopment project, only for Adrian to tear it to shreds because it offered no profit. "Why did you want to build a library and a vocational centre in the middle of a place reeking of crime and poverty?" Silas asked, his gaze sharp as if dissecting her thoughts. Elara took a deep breath, the fire of professional passion igniting in her weary eyes. "Because architecture isn't just soulless blocks of concrete to flaunt wealth. If you build a luxury tower amidst ruins, you only create envy. But if you build a place for them to learn, you give them a way out. Oakhaven needs bridges, Mr. Vane, not walls." Silas looked at her in silence. In his world, profit and power were the only metrics. Elara's ideals sounded naive, but the way she spoke of them, with fierce conviction and absolute faith, was something he had never seen in the hollow pretenses of the city's elite. "Ideals are a luxury, Elara, and in this city people often die for that luxury," Silas said coldly, but then he pushed an expensive fountain pen toward her. "I will fund this project. In exchange, you will work under me as the chief architect of the Vane Group. You will no longer be a free individual. Every drawing, every idea of yours belongs to me." Elara froze. He wanted her to work for him? This was not just protection. This was a professional tethering. "Do you want to use my project to launder the reputation of your underground activities?" she asked bluntly. Silas stepped closer, his breath carrying the familiar scent of sandalwood, but this time it was heavy with pressure. He leaned down, hands bracing against the desk, pinning her in the narrow space between them. "You should learn to be silent and accept if you want to survive. I don't need to launder my reputation because in Oakhaven, I am the reputation. I want this project because it will drive the Sterling family mad to see the thing they threw away become the crown upon my head. And more importantly," he reached out, his thumb gently grazing the fading bruise on her neck, a gesture both tender and threatening. "I enjoy owning things that are precious and stubborn. You are exactly that, Elara." Just then, Calum entered, his face urgent. "Sir, Adrian Sterling is in the lobby. He has a team of lawyers and is demanding to see his fiancée. He's threatening to sue us for kidnapping." Silas pulled his hand away, his eyes instantly turning lethal. He adjusted his cuffs, a faint, chilling smile appearing on his lips. "He wants to play with the law? Fine. Elara, do you want to hide here, or do you want to come down with me and put a final stop to his existence in your mind?" Elara looked at the pen on the desk, then into Silas's grey eyes. She knew that if she stepped down there, she would officially declare herself as Silas Vane's before the man who had tormented her. It was a path with no return. "I will go with you," she replied, her voice no longer trembling. Silas nodded, a spark of satisfaction flickering in his eyes. He reached out his hand, a courtly gesture that allowed no refusal. Elara placed her small hand into his large, warm palm. "Remember this, Elara Thorne," Silas whispered as they stepped toward the elevator. "From this moment on, the name Sterling holds no power over you. But be careful, for my shadows run much deeper than his cruelty." In the lobby of the Vane Empire Tower, Adrian Sterling was screaming, his usually polished face now distorted and pathetic. But when the private elevator doors opened and Silas Vane stepped out with Elara Thorne on his arm, radiant and majestic like a queen, the room fell into an abrupt, dead silence. Elara's true battle had only just begun. The lobby of the Vane Empire Tower was a cathedral of power, a vast expanse of white marble, brushed steel, and silence so heavy it felt tangible. But today, that silence was shattered. Adrian Sterling stood in the center of the hall, his face flushed a frantic shade of crimson. He was flanked by 4 men in grey suits, lawyers from the city's most expensive firm, holding briefcases like shields. To anyone else, Adrian still looked like the wealthy scion of Oakhaven, but to the staff of Vane Empire, he looked like a panicked animal barking at a mountain. "I know she's here. You are harboring a fugitive," Adrian roared at the reception desk. "Elara Thorne is under a legally binding marriage contract with the Sterling estate. If you don't release her this instant, I will have the police tear this building apart." The receptionist didn't blink. She had been trained by Silas Vane. She feared nothing living. Suddenly, the private elevator at the back of the lobby chimed, a low, melodic note that resonated through the marble hall. The lawyers instinctively stepped back. Adrian froze, his eyes darting toward the opening doors. Silas Vane emerged first. He hadn't bothered with a coat. He stood in his waistcoat and rolled up sleeves, looking every bit the predator who had just finished a meal. But it was the woman beside him who stole the air from the room. Elara Thorne walked at his side, her hand resting firmly on his forearm. She was no longer wearing the tattered silk from the gala. Martha had dressed her in a tailored charcoal blazer and trousers that emphasized her sharp, professional elegance. Her hair was pulled back, exposing the fading bruises on her neck, not as marks of shame, but as evidence for the war that was about to begin. Adrian gasped, a mixture of lust, rage, and shock contorting his features. "Elara, get away from that monster right now. How dare you humiliate me like this? Come here." He stepped forward, reaching out as if to grab her. Calum moved with the speed of a strike, his large hand planting itself on Adrian's chest and shoving him back 3 paces. "Careful, Sterling." Silas's voice was a low growl that made the lawyer's knees tremble. "You are on my soil now. In this building, your name has the same value as the dirt on my shoes." "This is kidnapping, Vane," Adrian screamed, pointing a shaking finger. "I have the contracts. She signed her life to the Sterling family. She belongs to us." One of the lawyers stepped forward, trembling. "Mr. Vane, legally speaking, the domestic partnership agreement signed by Miss Thorne grants Mr. Sterling guardianship over her affairs and—" "Guardianship?" Elara interrupted. Her voice wasn't the whisper from the gala. It was cold, precise, and resonated with the authority of an architect presenting a flawed design. She stepped away from Silas, moving closer to Adrian, though Calum remained a human wall between them. "You mean the contract you forced me to sign while my father was in the ICU? The one you leveraged against his medical bills?" Elara pulled a tablet from her blazer, a device Calum had prepared for her. "Let's talk about legality, Adrian." She swiped the screen, and a large hologram projected into the center of the lobby for everyone to see. It wasn't a marriage contract. It was a ledger of systematic abuse. "Exhibit A," Elara said, her eyes locked onto Adrian's. "Hospital records from 6 months ago. A fall down the stairs that resulted in 3 broken ribs. Exhibit B, audio recordings from your smart home system, which you forgot I helped design. Shall we play the one where you threatened to burn my blueprints if I ever spoke to another man? Adrian's face went from red to a ghostly, sickly white. The lawyers looked at each other, their professional confidence evaporating. Those are fabrications. You're a delusional woman, Adrian stammered. And finally, Silas stepped forward, his presence looming over the entire scene like a dark eclipse. The Sterling Group's tax evasion records from the Southport. My team spent the last 4 hours digging through the files your father tried so hard to bury. It seems the partnership you wanted with me is no longer an option. Instead, you'll be having a very long partnership with the district attorney. Silas looked at the lawyers. If you stay in this building for another 60 seconds, I will ensure your firm loses its license by sundown. Leave. The lawyers didn't wait for a second invitation. They turned and fled through the revolving doors, leaving Adrian standing alone in the center of the vast marble floor. Elara walked up to Adrian, stopping just inches from Caleb's protective reach. She looked at the man who had been her nightmare for 2 years. He looked small. He looked pathetic. I used to wonder why you hurt me, Adrian, she said softly, her voice filled with a chilling pity. I realize now it was because you knew you could never build anything as beautiful as I could. You had to break me because you were already broken. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the diamond engagement ring Adrian had forced onto her finger. She didn't hand it to him. She dropped it. The ring hit the marble floor with a sharp clink and rolled away into a storm drain grate in the floor. Go home, Adrian. If you ever come near me, or my project, or this building again, Silas won't have to destroy you. I will. Adrian looked at her, then at Silas, who was watching him with the bored hunger of a shark. With a choked sob of rage and humiliation, Adrian Sterling turned and ran out of the tower, his dignity trailing behind him like rags. The lobby returned to its heavy silence. The staff returned to their work, though their eyes remained fixed on Elara with a newfound respect. Elara felt the adrenaline leave her body, replaced by a staggering exhaustion. She began to sway, but Silas was there instantly. His hand gripped her waist, steadying her. It wasn't the bruising grip of Adrian. It was a solid, immovable support. You handled that well, Silas murmured, his grey eyes searching hers. For the first time, there was something other than cold calculation in his gaze. There was admiration. I'm tired, Silas, she admitted, leaning slightly into him. Is it over? For him? Yes, for us. Silas looked up at the towering heights of his empire. This was just the demolition phase, Elara. Now, we start to build. As they walked back toward the elevator, Elara looked at her reflection in the polished marble. The bruises were still there, but they looked different now. They looked like the scars of a survivor who had finally found the strength to set her own house on fire, just to see the monster inside burn. Silas pressed the button for the top floor. As the doors closed, separating them from the world below, he reached out and gently tilted her chin up. Tomorrow, you go to the East End. You show them your plans. You show this city that the Sterling era is dead and the Vane era, well, it has a new architect. The transition from the sterile marble halls of Cloud Peak Manor to the gritty, dust-choked streets of Oakhaven's East End was a physical shock to the system. Elara sat in the back of a black SUV, her eyes fixed on the window. As they moved further from the city centre, the gleaming glass towers were replaced by crumbling brick tenements, boarded-up storefronts, and alleyways that seemed to swallow the morning light. This was the place Adrian had called the armpit of the world. To Elara, it was a graveyard of potential. You look like you're going into battle, Silas said, breaking the silence. He was sitting next to her, looking remarkably out of place in his tailored suit amidst the urban decay. "In a way, I am," Elara replied, clutching her leather portfolio. "These people have been promised renewal by politicians and developers for decades. Every time it's just a front for gentrification. They won't trust me because I'm coming in a car that costs more than their neighborhood." Silas leaned back, his eyes unreadable. "Trust isn't given, Elara. It's built brick by brick. Just like your buildings. If you want them to listen, don't talk like a developer. Talk like a neighbor." The SUV pulled up to a vacant lot overgrown with weeds and littered with debris, the designated site for the vocational center. A small crowd had already gathered, tipped off by Calum's advance team. They weren't cheering, they were scowling. Men with calloused hands and women with tired eyes watched as Silas and Elara stepped out of the vehicle. A tall man with a jagged scar across his cheek stepped forward. This was Jax, a local leader who held more sway in the East End than any elected official. "Vane," Jax spat, his voice like grinding gravel. "Come to buy up another block and kick us out? We heard the Sterling brat was out and you were in. Different wolf, same teeth." Silas didn't flinch. He didn't even use his usual intimidating posture. He stepped aside, gesturing toward Elara. "I'm just the bank, Jax. She's the vision. Talk to her." Elara felt the weight of 20 suspicious gazes. Her throat was dry, but she remembered the blueprints Adrian had burned. She remembered why she had designed them in the first place. She walked past Silas, past the armed guards, and stood directly in front of Jax. "I'm not here to build condos," she started, her voice steady. "And I'm not here to give you a park with a fountain that will be broken in a week." She opened her portfolio and pulled out a large, hand-drawn render. It wasn't a glossy, computer-generated image. It was a sketch, raw, detailed, and filled with life. "This is a vocational center," she pointed to the drawing. "The ground floor is a public library and a daycare for working mothers. The second floor is a workshop for carpentry, electrical work, and coding. The materials aren't imported marble. I've specified reclaimed brick from the old foundry down the street. I want to hire local crews to build it. Your sons, your brothers?" Jax squinted at the drawing. "Why? What's the catch?" "The catch is that you have to protect it," Elara said firmly. "This belongs to the East End, not the Vane Group. If Silas Vane tries to turn this into a luxury mall in 5 years, the contract I'm making him sign today says the land reverts back to a community trust." Silas raised an eyebrow, a flicker of genuine surprise, and perhaps a hint of amusement crossing his face. She hadn't mentioned that part of the contract to him. Jax looked from the drawing to Elara, then to Silas. The tension in the air didn't vanish, but it shifted. "You've got guts, lady. Most people who come here don't look us in the eye." "I grew up 3 blocks from here, Jax," Elara lied, partially. Her grandmother had lived here, and Elara had spent her summers playing in these very streets before her father's business had taken them to the suburbs. "I know what it's like to watch the skyline grow while your own roof leaks." Jax went silent for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "We'll watch. But if one brick goes toward a penthouse for a rich man, we'll burn the whole thing down." "I'd expect nothing less," Elara replied. As they walked back to the car, the crowd began to disperse, talking in hushed, curious tones. For the first time, Elara felt a spark of real hope. Inside the SUV, the atmosphere was different. Silas was watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "A community trust, Elara?" he asked, his voice low. "You're a dangerous negotiator. You just stripped a multi-million-dollar asset out of my portfolio before the first stone was even laid." "You said you wanted to drive the Sterlings mad," Elara reminded him, her heart hammering. Nothing will make them angrier than seeing you waste money on people they consider beneath them. Besides, you told me to talk like a neighbor." Silas let out a short, dry laugh, the first time she had heard him truly laugh. It was a rich, dark sound. "So I did. You're learning fast." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers for a second, before he pulled back. "But don't mistake my indulgence for weakness. The Sterling family is reeling, but Adrian's father, Arthur Sterling, is an old fox. He won't let his son's humiliation go unpunished. He will come for the project, and he will come for you." "Let him," Elara said, looking out at the crumbling foundry. "I've spent 2 years being afraid of a shadow. I'm not afraid of an old man in a suit." "Good," Silas murmured. He turned to look out his own window, but his reflection in the glass showed a slight softening of his jaw. "Because the foundations are the hardest part to pour. Once the cement sets, there's no turning back." That evening, back at Cloud Peak, Elara found a small box on her desk. Inside was an old silver drafting compass, an antique, beautifully crafted and perfectly balanced. There was no note, but she knew the scent of sandalwood that lingered on the velvet lining. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city. She was still a prisoner, in a sense, living in a fortress guarded by men with guns. But as she held the compass in her hand, she realized the difference. Adrian had wanted to break her tools. Silas was giving them back. Below, the lights of Oakhaven flickered. In the distance, the East End remained dark, but Elara began to sketch. She wasn't just designing a building anymore. She was designing a war, and for the first time in her life, she had the strongest ally in the world standing in her corner. The antique silver drafting compass sat on Elara's desk, reflecting the cold, blue moonlight of Oakhaven. It was a tool of precision, a gift that felt like an unspoken promise. But the peace of Cloud Peak Manor was a fragile thing, shattered the next morning by the sound of a glass vase splintering in the main hall. Elara hurried out of her suite to find Silas standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back rigid, his hands clenched behind him. On the monitors in the hallway, news headlines were already hemorrhaging red. "Vane project stalled. Arson at East End Foundry." "Silas?" she whispered. "They burned the materials," Silas said, his voice a low, vibrating hum of suppressed rage. "The reclaimed bricks you wanted, the timber. Everything delivered yesterday is ash. Jax and his men managed to chase off the vans, but the damage is done." Elara felt a cold hollow open in her stomach. "It's Adrian. It has to be." "No." Silas turned, his eyes like sharpened flint. "Adrian is a petulant child. He burns bridges because he's angry. This wasn't anger. It was a surgical strike. This was Arthur Sterling." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Calum appeared, holding a tablet. "Sir, Arthur Sterling is on line 1. He says it's a neighbourly check-in." Silas took the tablet, his face settling into a mask of terrifying calm. He tapped the screen. The face of an older man appeared, silver-haired, wearing a 3-piece suit, sitting in a mahogany-panelled office that looked more like a throne room. Arthur Sterling didn't look like a villain. He looked like a grandfather. A very dangerous grandfather. "Silas," Arthur said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "I heard about the unfortunate accident at your new charity site. It's a shame. Those old neighborhoods are so prone to electrical fires, aren't they?" "Arthur," Silas replied, his tone devoid of emotion. "I assume you didn't call to offer a fire safety lecture." "I called to offer a solution. My son informs me that you've taken an interest in a piece of Sterling property, Miss Thorne. And now you're wasting Vane resources on a slum. Let's be adults. Return the girl, cancel the East End contract, and I'll ensure the fires stop. I might even overlook the audit you're trying to trigger at the port." Elara stepped into the camera's view, her jaw set. "I am not property, Mr. Sterling, and the bricks you burned were just clay. We'll make more." Arthur's eyes shifted to her, a predatory glint appearing in their depths. "Ah, the architect. My son told me you had spirit. It's a pity Silas is going to get you killed trying to prove a point. Silas, think about your legacy. Is one girl worth a war with me?" "She isn't a girl, Arthur," Silas said, stepping closer to Elara until their shoulders brushed. "She is the chief architect of the Vane Group. And you didn't just burn clay. You burned my clay. You have 24 hours to retire or I stop playing by the city's rules." Silas cut the connection before Arthur could respond. The silence that followed was heavy. Elara looked at Silas, seeing the tension in his jaw. "You told Jax the foundations were the hardest part. Arthur just tried to crack them." Silas walked to the bar, but he didn't pour a drink. He stared at his reflection in the glass. "Do you know why I hate them, Elara? Why I spent 10 years trying to bleed the Sterling family dry?" Elara shook her head. "I thought it was just business." "My mother was an architect too," Silas said, his voice barely a whisper. 25 years ago, she designed a low-income housing complex, much like yours. She refused to use the cheap, dangerous materials Arthur's father tried to force on her. She wouldn't take the kickbacks. He paused, his hand tightening around the edge of the marble counter. The building accidentally collapsed during construction. She was on site. The Sterlings used their connections to bury the investigation, calling it architectural negligence. They ruined her name before they even buried her body. I was 15. Elara reached out, her hand hovering over his arm before she finally made contact. His muscle was like stone beneath her touch. "Silas, I didn't know." "Now you do," he said, turning to look at her. The ice in his eyes had melted into something raw and burning. "Arthur thinks he's repeating history. He thinks he can burn your project and break you just like his father did to mine. He thinks I'm still that 15-year-old boy standing in the rubble." He reached out, his fingers grazing the drafting compass on the desk. "We aren't going to just rebuild, Elara. We're going to build something they can't burn. I want you to double the size of the center. We're adding a medical clinic and a legal aid office. We're going to make that site the heart of Oakhaven, and we're going to guard it with every man I have." "That's not just a building anymore," Elara said, her heart racing. "That's a fortress." "Exactly," Silas murmured. He stepped closer, his presence enveloping her. "Arthur Sterling wants a war. I'm going to give him a massacre. But I need to know, are you still in my corner?" Elara looked at the drafting compass, then back at Silas. She saw the pain he had carried for 2 decades, and she saw the hope he was trying so hard to hide under his armor. She realized then that they weren't just allies. They were 2 people who had both been broken by the same family, trying to build something whole out of the pieces. "I'm not leaving, Silas," she said firmly. "Pour the cement. I'll handle the rest." Silas looked at her for a long beat, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, the first one that reached his eyes. "Calum, get Jax on the phone. Tell him I'm sending 100 men and enough concrete to pave the harbour. And tell him the architect has a new set of plans." As Silas walked out of the room, Elara picked up the silver compass. She realized that Silas hadn't just given her a tool. He had given her his trust, and in the shadow of Oakhaven's tallest towers, that was the most dangerous weapon of all. The air at the East End construction site had changed. It no longer smelled of stagnant river water and despair. It smelled of wet concrete, diesel, and the sharp, metallic tang of tension. Silas had kept his word. 100 men, Vane's private security, now patrolled the perimeter, their eyes scanning every alleyway and rooftop. They weren't just building a vocational center anymore. They were building a statement. Elara stood on a makeshift scaffolding, her charcoal blazer replaced by a heavy canvas jacket, a hard hat pulled low over her brow. Below her, Jax was directing a crew of locals, their movements synchronized with Silas's professional team. The animosity from their first meeting had been forged into a gritty, mutual respect. "You're pushing them hard, Elara," a voice rumbled from behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was Silas. He was dressed down today, black tactical sweater and dark jeans, but he still looked like he owned the ground he walked on. "We have to," Elara replied, pointing to the foundation. "Arthur Sterling's 24 hours are almost up. When the sun goes down, he won't be sending men with lighters. He'll be sending something bigger." Silas climbed up beside her, looking out over the neighborhood. "Let him. My men are positioned. Oakhaven is a city built on secrets, but even Arthur can't hide a full-scale assault." Elara looked at him, the moonlight reflecting in his grey eyes. She remembered what he'd told her about his mother. "Silas, why didn't Calum know about your mother's blueprints? I saw his face when you mentioned her yesterday. He was surprised." Silas's jaw tightened. He looked away toward the dark silhouette of the old foundry. "Because Calum knows the Silas Vane who built an empire. He doesn't know the boy who lived in a basement in the East End for 3 years after the building collapsed." Elara's heart skipped. "You lived here, in the slums?" Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, charred piece of wood. It looked like a fragment of a doorframe. "After the collapse, the Sterlings didn't just ruin my mother's name. They froze our assets. They sued her estate for damages. My father died of a broken heart 6 months later. I had nothing. I survived on these streets by being faster and meaner than the boys twice my size." He looked at the charred wood, his thumb tracing its jagged edge. "I didn't start the Vane Group with a loan from a bank, Elara. I started it with the money I made protecting shopkeepers in the East End from men like Arthur Sterling. I built my first office in the basement of that very foundry they burned yesterday." The revelation hit Elara like a physical blow. Silas Vane wasn't a demon who had descended upon the city. He was a product of its most neglected corners. His hatred for the Sterlings wasn't just corporate rivalry. It was a lifelong war for the soul of the place he had once called home. "Is that why the vocational centre has a legal aid office?" she asked softly. "Because the law only works for people who can afford it," Silas said, finally turning to look at her. "I want a place where a kid from the East End can walk in and get the help I never had. I want them to have a name that the Sterlings can't erase." Suddenly, the air was sliced by the shrill, staccato burst of a whistle. Jax was standing at the edge of the site, pointing toward the north gate. A line of black SUVs was approaching, not Vane's vehicles. They were unmarked, moving with a predatory slowness. "Get down!" Silas roared, grabbing Elara's waist and pulling her off the scaffolding just as a hail of gunfire shattered the wooden planks where they had been standing seconds before. The site erupted into chaos. Vane's men returned fire instantly, their training taking over. Jax's crew scrambled for cover behind the heavy concrete mixers. Silas pulled a sleek, matte black handgun from a holster Elara hadn't noticed, his movements calm, almost clinical. "Calum! Flank the north gate. Jax, get your men into the legal aid wing. It's the most reinforced section." Silas barked into a radio. He turned to Elara, his eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. "Stay low. Move toward the basement. There's a reinforced bunker near the elevator shaft." "I'm not leaving you!" Elara screamed over the deafening roar of the exchange. "This isn't a discussion, Elara. If you die, Arthur wins. The project dies. Everything we've built becomes a grave. Go." He didn't wait for her to argue. He pushed her toward the stairs and vaulted over a pile of rebar, heading straight into the heat of the fire. Elara ran, her lungs burning, her mind a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. She reached the basement, but as she descended the stairs, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A man was already there. He was leaning against the concrete pillar, a smirk on his face. He wasn't one of Arthur's hired guns. He was wearing an expensive tailored suit that looked identical to the one Silas had worn at the gala. "Hello, Elara," Adrian Sterling said, stepping into the dim light. He held a silenced pistol, his hand remarkably steady for a man who had been a whimpering coward a few weeks ago. "Did you really think my father would do all the heavy lifting? He wants the project dead. I just want you." "Adrian," Elara breathed, backing away toward the shadows. "You're insane. Silas will kill you." "Silas is busy dying in a hole," Adrian laughed, a shrill, unhinged sound. "He thinks he's a king because he has a tower, but a king is nothing without his crown. And you, Elara, you are the only thing he's ever truly wanted. Taking you is the only way to break him." He stepped closer, the gun leveled at her heart. "Now, walk toward the service tunnel. My car is waiting. We're going to leave Oakhaven, and you're going to spend the rest of your life remembering why you never should have kissed a stranger." Elara looked at the drafting compass she still held in her pocket. She felt the cold, sharp point of the needle through the fabric. She realized then that Silas was right. Trust was a building, but it was also a weapon. "I didn't kiss a stranger, Adrian," Elara said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. "I kissed the man who was going to bury you." She lunged forward, not away from him, but at him. The basement echoed with the sound of a single, muffled shot, followed by a scream that didn't belong to Elara. The basement was a tomb of shadows and the smell of ozone. Adrian Sterling let out a strangled, gurgling cry, dropping his silenced pistol as he clutched his thigh. Elara stood over him, her breathing ragged, the silver drafting compass in her hand stained with a dark, blooming crimson. She hadn't aimed for his heart. She had aimed for the leg, using the precision of an architect to find the gap in his guard. You bitch," Adrian hissed, his face contorting into a mask of pathetic agony. "My father will skin you alive for this." "Your father isn't here, Adrian," Elara said, her voice trembling but held together by a cold, newfound steel. "And neither is the girl you used to break." She kicked the fallen pistol across the concrete floor, sending it skittering into the darkness just as heavy footsteps thundered down the stairs. Elara spun around, the compass raised, but she lowered it the moment a familiar silhouette broke through the dust. Silas Vane looked like he had crawled out of the mouth of a furnace. His tactical sweater was torn, his knuckles were bloodied, and his grey eyes were burning with a terrifying, primal light. He took in the scene, the wounded Adrian, the weaponless Elara, and the blood on the silver tool. "Elara," he breathed, the word a mixture of relief and a dark, simmering pride. He moved past her with the speed of a predator, his hand closing around Adrian's throat and lifting him off the floor until the younger Sterling's toes barely touched the concrete. "I told you to stay away from her," Silas growled, his voice a vibration of pure lethality. "I told your father that I would stop playing by the rules. Did you think I was joking?" "Silas, wait," Elara called out, her hand reaching for his arm. Silas didn't loosen his grip. Adrian's face was turning a sickly shade of purple, his hands clawing weakly at Silas's iron wrist. "He tried to take me, Silas. He wanted to use me to break you." "And for that, he dies," Silas said, his thumb pressing into Adrian's windpipe. "No," Elara said firmly, stepping between Silas and the wall. "If you kill him here in the dark, you're just the demon they say you are. You're just another man in a suit solving problems with blood. Let him live. Let him go back to Arthur as a broken messenger. Let them see that their property has teeth." Silas's eyes locked onto hers. The silence in the basement was heavy, punctuated only by the distant, dying echoes of gunfire from the surface. For a moment, Elara saw the 15-year-old boy in Silas, the one who wanted to burn everything down. Then, slowly, the tension in his arm receded. He dropped Adrian like a sack of refuse. "Calum," Silas barked into his radio. "Get down here, clean this up. Throw the Sterling brat into the street. If his father wants him, he can come collect him from the gutter." Calum appeared moments later, followed by 2 guards. But as Calum reached for Adrian, Elara noticed Silas's eyes shift. He wasn't looking at Adrian anymore. He was looking at Calum's shoulder, at a small, circular pin pinned to the inside of the security chief's tactical vest. It was the crest of the Sterling Foundation. The world seemed to stop. Silas didn't move, but the air around him turned arctic. Calum froze, realizing the slip-up, his hand hovering over his holster. "Calum," Silas said, his voice so quiet it was more terrifying than a scream. "How long?" Calum didn't hesitate. He drew his weapon, but Silas was faster. He didn't pull a gun. He lunged, his palms striking Calum's chin and sending him crashing into the concrete pillar. The 2 men, brothers in arms for a decade, became a blur of violent, expert motion. "They promised me the port, Silas!" Calum roared as they hit the ground, a knife appearing in his hand. "You were getting soft, wasting millions on this slum because of a girl. You were going to get us all killed for a ghost." "I was giving us a soul," Silas retorted, his elbow striking Calum's temple with a sickening thud. Silas disarmed him with a brutal twist of the wrist, pinning Calum to the floor. The guard stood paralyzed, unsure who to follow. "I took you out of the dirt, Calum," Silas whispered, his chest heaving. "I gave you a name, and you sold it for a piece of the Sterling's rot?" "The Sterlings are Oakhaven, Silas," Calum spat, blood leaking from his mouth. "You're just a temporary eclipse. Arthur always wins." Silas looked at the man he had trusted with his life, then at Elara, who stood pale and shaken by the revelation. The betrayal was a crack in the very foundations Silas had built. "Not today," Silas said. He looked at the other guards. "Take them both. Adrian to the street, Calum to the holding cells in the tower. I'll deal with him when the sun comes up." The guards moved, the heavy atmosphere of betrayal lingering like smoke. As they dragged the 2 men away, Silas stood alone in the center of the basement, the darkness threatening to swallow him whole. Elara walked over to him, her own fear forgotten in the face of his devastation. She didn't say anything. She simply picked up the silver drafting compass from the floor, wiped the blood from it with her sleeve, and placed it back into his hand. "The foundations are cracked, Silas," she said softly, "but the architect is still here." Silas looked down at the tool, his fingers closing around it until the metal bit into his skin. He looked at her, and for the first time, Elara saw a flicker of vulnerability in the demon of Oakhaven. "I have nothing left but the project, Elara," he admitted. "Then we make it the strongest thing this city has ever seen," she replied. Outside, the first light of dawn began to bleed over the East End, illuminating the smoke and the wreckage. The battle was over, but the war had reached its most personal stage. As they walked out of the ruins together, Silas Vane realized that he hadn't just saved an architect. He had found the only person in the world who could help him rebuild a life that had been under demolition for 25 years. The morning after the blood in the bricks was not spent in rest. While the East End smouldered and the city of Oakhaven began to whisper about the failed assassination attempt on Silas Vane, the man himself was a whirlwind of cold, calculated destruction. Back at Cloud Peak Manor, the atmosphere was electric with a different kind of tension. Silas had spent the last 6 hours in his study, a secure room lined with servers that hummed like a swarm of angry hornets. He wasn't using guns anymore. He was using the one thing that hit harder than a bullet: the truth. "If Arthur Sterling wants to play by the rules of the city," Silas muttered, his fingers flying across a customized keyboard, "then I will show him exactly how brittle his rules are." Elara stood by the doorway, holding a cup of black coffee she knew he wouldn't drink. She watched as hundreds of documents, offshore bank statements, falsified shipping manifests, and bribes paid to city council members began to leak into the servers of the Oakhaven Chronicle and the district attorney's office. It was a scorched earth audit, a financial execution performed in the dead of night. "You're destroying him," Elara said, her voice a mixture of awe and trepidation. "But you're also exposing yourself, Silas. Some of these files are linked to Vane Group subsidiaries." "I am a man who has lived in the dark for 25 years, Elara," Silas said, finally looking up. His eyes were bloodshot, the grey irises looking like cracked glass. "I can survive the light. Arthur Sterling is a creature of the sun. He will burn when his secrets are exposed." "Go to bed, Silas," she urged. "You've done enough for one night." "Not yet," he whispered, turning back to the screens. "The demolition is nearly complete. I just need to find the cornerstone." Elara realized then that she couldn't help him with this part of the war. She retreated into the quiet halls of the manor, her mind wandering back to the basement and the look on Silas's face when he saw Calum's betrayal. She felt a strange, magnetic pull towards the West Wing, a section of the penthouse she'd been told was off-limits for security reasons. With Calum in a holding cell and the manor's security in a state of flux, the heavy oak door that usually remained locked was slightly ajar. Elara pushed it open. It wasn't a server room or a weapons cache. It was a workshop. But unlike her modern, high-tech studio, this room smelled of old paper, cedarwood, and history. Dust motes danced in the moonlight that filtered through a skylight. In the center of the room stood a massive drafting table, identical to the one she had used in university, but worn smooth by decades of use. Spread across it were dozens of blueprints. Elara walked closer, her heart skipping a beat as she recognized the style. The lines were delicate, yet firm, the annotations written in an elegant, flowing script. These weren't Silas's plans. They were his mother's. Elara traced the edge of a blueprint for the housing complex that had collapsed. Beside it lay a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. She hesitated, then picked up the top one. It wasn't a business document. It was a letter to a young Silas. "My dearest Silas, architecture is not about the buildings we leave behind, but the shelter we provide for the souls within. They tell me the Sterlings want to cut costs on the foundations. They do not understand that a house built on a lie will always find its way to the ground. Stand tall, my little architect. Build only what can survive the truth." She was beautiful, wasn't she? Elara jumped, dropping the letter. Silas was standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hall. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted, his armor finally stripped away by the ghosts of the room. "I'm sorry," Elara whispered. "The door was open." Silas walked into the room, his footsteps silent on the wooden floor. He reached the drafting table and looked down at the blueprints. "I come here when the city feels too loud, when I forget why I'm doing all of this." He picked up the silver drafting compass Elara had returned to him earlier and placed it precisely on the center of his mother's final project. She knew Elara. She knew they were going to sabotage her. She spent her last night in this room, trying to find a way to reinforce the structure without the Sterlings knowing. She wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter. Elara looked at the blueprints, then at Silas. She realized then that the vocational center wasn't just a project to him. It was an attempt to finish his mother's last drawing. It was the shelter for souls she had never been allowed to complete. Silas, the audit. It's not just about revenge, is it? It's the only way to clear her name, he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. I've spent a decade gathering the proof that the Sterlings caused that collapse. Tonight, I finally sent the original material logs to the press. By morning, the world will know she wasn't negligent. She was murdered. He looked at Elara, and for the first time, he reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. His skin was rough, but his touch was incredibly gentle. I thought I had to be a demon to win this war, he whispered. I thought I had to break everything to keep you safe. But looking at you at the site, seeing you defend that building, I realized that the architect is more powerful than the demon. Elara leaned into his touch, the scent of sandalwood and old paper enveloping them. You don't have to choose, Silas. You can be the man who protects the shelter and the man who builds it. In the quiet of the hidden room, surrounded by the blueprints of his soul, Silas Vane did something he hadn't done in 25 years. He let go. He pulled Elara toward him, his arms wrapping around her with a desperate, honest intensity. It wasn't a kiss of QIUOC, covenant, or survival. It was a kiss of shared ruins and mutual foundations. Outside, the sun began to rise over Oakhaven. The phones in the Sterling mansion were beginning to ring. The police were heading for the port. The empire built on a lie was finally finding its way to the ground. But high above the city, in a room filled with history, Silas and Elara were finally beginning to draw a future that didn't involve fear. We have work to do, Silas murmured against her hair. We do, Elara smiled. Pour the cement, Silas. This time the foundations are made of truth. The morning sun did not bring peace to Oakhaven. It brought a reckoning. By 8 a.m., the Sterling Group's stock had plummeted to near zero. Federal agents were swarming the South Port, and the Oakhaven Chronicle had published a front-page spread that detailed 25 years of corruption, culminating in the structural murder of Silas Vane's mother. The city was a tinderbox, and the flame was about to be lit at the Sterling Group headquarters, a brutalist concrete monolith that stood as a grim reminder of Arthur Sterling's unyielding ego. He's locked himself in, Silas said, strapping a tactical holster over his shoulder. He stood in the middle of the Cloud Peak foyer, his face a mask of grim determination. Arthur has triggered the blackout protocol. The building is a pressurized tomb. He's shredded the physical files, but he's holding the master decryption key, the only thing that can link the city council's offshore accounts to the housing collapse. If he destroys that key, the politicians walk free, Elara said, her eyes fixed on a structural schematic of the Sterling Tower on her tablet. And your mother's name is only half cleared. I'm going in, Silas said. Jax and his men have the perimeter. The police are waiting for a warrant that Arthur's pet judges are delaying. I don't have time for warrants. You can't go in alone, Silas. That building is a labyrinth. Arthur designed it with security layers, trap hallways, dead-end elevators, and reinforced pressure doors. Elara stepped forward, her voice unwavering. I've studied the blueprints of that tower. I know why the ventilation shafts are oversized and where the load-bearing weak points are. You need an architect, or you'll be walking into a meat grinder. Silas looked at her, the instinct to protect warring with the cold reality of the mission. He saw the drafting compass pinned to her jacket like a badge of office. He realized then that he couldn't leave her behind, not because she was his property, but because she was his partner. Stay behind me, he commanded, and keep your radio on Channel 4. The air inside the Sterling Group headquarters was stale and smelled of ozone. The power had been cut, leaving the vast lobby in a ghostly, emergency red dimness. Silas and a small team of 4 specialists moved through the shadows with the practiced silence of ghosts. "The elevators are dead," Silas whispered. "Stairs?" "No," Elara replied, checking her tablet's offline cache. "The stairwells are equipped with magnetic locks and gas vents. If Arthur sees us on the cameras, he'll choke us out before we hit the 5th floor. We need to use the service lift in the kitchen. It runs on an isolated hydraulic circuit that's too old for the digital blackout to override." They moved through the darkened cafeteria, the clatter of their boots echoing off the stainless steel. They reached the lift, a cramped, vibrating cage that groaned as it ascended. "We need the 40th floor," Silas said, checking his weapon. "The executive suite." "We can't go to 40, Elara countered. "Arthur will have the hallway rigged. We go to 39. There's a structural bypass in the ceiling of the server room. It leads directly into the floor joists of Arthur's office." As the lift lurched to a halt at 39, the doors creaked open to a hallway filled with white smoke. "Flashlights on," Silas barked. They stepped out, but the floor beneath them suddenly groaned. Elara froze. Her ears, trained to hear the stress of materials, caught a high-pitched metallic pinging. "Stop!" she screamed. The specialist in front took one more step. The floor panel, weakened by intentional structural sabotage, gave way. Silas lunged, grabbing the man's vest and hauling him back, just as a 10-foot section of the floor plummeted into the darkness of the floor below. "Arthur didn't just lock the doors," Elara whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "He's deconstructing the building from the inside out. He's going to bring the whole tower down with him." "We don't have much time," Silas said, his jaw tight. "Lead us, Elara." Elara navigated them through the skeletal remains of the 39th floor, using her knowledge of the building's bones to find stable paths. They reached the server room, and Silas boosted her into the ceiling crawl space. She crawled through the narrow, dusty gap, the heat from the building's dying systems rising around her. Behind her, Silas moved with a surprising, fluid grace for a man of his size. They reached a reinforced steel grate. Below them was Arthur Sterling's office. Arthur was standing at a massive mahogany desk, a small glowing USB drive held between his trembling fingers. He looked older than he had on the screen, smaller, his regal posture shattered by the weight of his collapsing empire. Across from him, Adrian sat in a chair, his leg bandaged, his eyes wide with a manic, flickering terror. "It's over, Dad," Adrian whimpered. "Just give it to them. Maybe we can negotiate." "Negotiate?" Arthur spat, his voice a jagged rasp. "I built this city from the mud, Adrian. I didn't build it to hand the keys to the son of a woman I broke 20 years ago. If I burn, Oakhaven burns with me." Arthur reached for a heavy brass lighter on the desk. Next to it was a remote detonator. "He's rigged the gas mains," Elara whispered. Silas didn't wait. He kicked the grate through. The heavy steel slammed onto the mahogany desk, sent the lighter flying, and Silas dropped into the room like a vengeful shadow. He had his weapon leveled at Arthur before the dust had even settled. Elara dropped down beside him, her drafting compass held like a dagger. "Drop the drive, Arthur," Silas said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "And the detonator." Arthur laughed, a shrill, broken sound. "You have your mother's eyes, Silas, so full of pathetic hope. Do you think a drive will save you? This building is already a coffin." "The drive won't save me," Silas said, stepping closer. "It will save her legacy, and it will ensure you spend the rest of your life in a cell, watching me build over your grave." Adrian lunged for the fallen lighter, his eyes wide with desperation. "I won't go to jail. I won't." "Adrian, no!" Elara shouted. Silas fired. The bullet struck the lighter, shattering it into a dozen harmless pieces of flint and steel. The force of the shot sent Adrian sprawling back into his chair. Silas moved with a blur of motion, his hand closing around Arthur's wrist and twisting. The master decryption key dropped to the floor. Elara lunged, snatching it up and tucking it into her jacket. "We're leaving," Silas barked, grabbing Arthur by the collar. "You're too late," Arthur screamed, pointing at the remote on the desk. "The timer was already set. 30 seconds. The building groaned, a deep, tectonic roar that vibrated through the soles of their boots. The windows of the executive suite shattered outward as the first of the secondary charges in the lower floors blew. "The service shaft," Elara pointed to the wall behind the desk. "It's the only reinforced vertical column in the core. We can use the emergency cable." They sprinted. Silas dragged a resisting Arthur, and Elara grabbed a stunned Adrian by the arm, dragging him toward the heavy steel door of the service shaft. They threw themselves inside, Silas slamming the magnetic bolt home, just as the main gas line on the 40th floor ignited. The explosion was deafening, a wall of heat and sound that hammered against the steel door. The shaft groaned, the heavy emergency cable whipping violently. "Hold on!" Silas roared, wrapping one arm around Elara and the other around the cable's manual brake. They descended in a terrifying, controlled fall, the world above them dissolving into fire and falling concrete. When they hit the ground floor, the lobby was filled with dust and the sirens of 1,000 emergency vehicles. Silas kicked the service door open, stumbling out into the morning light, still holding the collar of a broken Arthur Sterling. Elara collapsed onto the cool marble, her lungs gasping for clean air. She reached into her pocket and felt the hard, cold plastic of the decryption key. Silas stood over her, his face covered in soot, his tactical sweater shredded. He looked toward the Sterling Tower. The top 5 floors were a jagged crown of fire, but the core, the reinforced column Elara had identified, still stood. He reached down, helping her to her feet. Across the street, the press was filming everything. Jax and his men were cheering. The police were finally moving in to take custody of the Sterlings. "You saved the key," Silas whispered, his eyes searching hers. "We saved the city," she replied. Silas looked at Arthur, who was being cuffed by a federal agent. The old man looked at Silas, his eyes filled with a hollow, impotent hatred. "Your mother was a fool, Vane," Arthur hissed. Silas didn't strike him. He simply leaned in, his voice a calm, chilling whisper. "My mother built things that lasted, Arthur. You built a tower that fell in a single night. Guess which one Oakhaven will remember?" As the Sterlings were led away, Silas turned to Elara. He pulled her into his arms, oblivious to the cameras, the smoke, and the ruins of the Empire behind them. Elara looked up at the rising sun, then at the man beside her. "Then let's go home, Silas. We have a vocational center to finish." 6 months had passed since the night the Sterling Tower fell, leaving a jagged, hollowed-out tooth in the Oakhaven skyline. The city had begun to heal, or at least, it had begun to forget. Arthur Sterling was rotting in a federal penitentiary, and Adrian had been institutionalized, his mind finally snapping under the weight of his own failure. But for Elara Thorne, the world had only grown louder. The East End Vocational Centre stood as a defiant miracle amidst the soot-stained brick of the slums. It was a masterpiece of glass, reclaimed timber, and reinforced concrete. Today was the official opening, but there were no red carpets or gold-plated scissors. There were only the people of the East End, hundreds of them standing in a quiet, respectful semicircle around the entrance. Elara stood at the podium, her charcoal blazer replaced by a simple, elegant navy dress. She looked at the crowd, seeing Jax in the front row, his arms crossed, a rare, genuine smile tugging at his scarred face. "This building doesn't belong to the Vane group," Elara said, her voice amplified by the crisp autumn air. "And it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the hands that built it and the souls that will fill it. Architecture is a conversation between the past and the future. Today, the East End is finally speaking back." Silas Vane stood in the shadows of the entrance, leaning against a concrete pillar. He didn't take the stage. He didn't need to. He watched Elara with an intensity that had shifted over the months, from a predator's curiosity to a partner's devotion. He looked less like the demon of Oakhaven and more like a man who had finally found a home. As the ceremony concluded and the doors opened, the building was instantly flooded with life. Children ran toward the daycare, young men gathered in the carpentry workshops, elders moved slowly into the sun-drenched library. "You did it," Silas murmured, appearing at Elara's side as the crowd surged past them. "My mother would have loved the light in that atrium." "We did it, Silas," she corrected, taking his hand. His palm was warm, the tension that used to define him having settled into a steady, quiet strength. "But why do you keep looking at the north gate? Caleb's replacement said the perimeter is clear." Silas didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on a silver Jaguar parked a block away, a car that didn't belong in the East End and certainly didn't belong to anyone Silas knew. "Oakhaven is like a deck of cards, Elara," Silas said softly. "You remove the king of spades, like Arthur, and the whole deck reshuffles. Someone always fills the vacuum." Later that evening, the celebration had moved to the top floor of the centre, a rooftop garden overlooking the city. The atmosphere was light, filled with the smell of wood smoke and the sound of Jax's laughter. But Silas was missing. Elara found him in the legal aid office on the second floor. He wasn't alone. A woman stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the rising moon. She was tall, dressed in a white silk suit that looked like a shroud. Her hair was a shock of platinum silver, and when she turned, her eyes were a piercing, unnatural blue. "Silas," the woman said, her voice like silk over shattered glass. "You've grown into your father's shoulders. It's a pity you've inherited your mother's sentimentality." Silas didn't move. He stood behind the desk, his hands flat on the mahogany surface. "The East End is off limits to you, Vesper." "Vesper?" Elara stepped into the room, her designer heels clicking sharply on the new floor. "Silas, who is this?" The woman, Vesper, looked at Elara, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her lips. "So this is the little architect, the one who made the demon of Oakhaven trade his fire for a library. I am Vesper Vane, Elara. Silas's sister, or at least the one the family preferred to keep in the shadows." Elara felt the air leave the room. Silas had never mentioned a sister, not once. "She's not my sister by blood," Silas said, his voice a low, warning growl. "She was my father's ward, the daughter of the man who helped Arthur Sterling facilitate the building collapse 25 years ago. My father took her in to keep his enemies close. I threw her out the day he died. And yet, here I am," Vesper said, walking toward Elara with a fluid, terrifying grace. She reached out, her fingers grazing the lapel of Elara's dress. "Silas thinks he's won because Arthur is in a cell. He doesn't realize that Arthur was just a middleman. The Sterlings were the muscle, Silas. My father was the mind, and I have come to collect the inheritance you stole from me." "You have nothing here," Silas said, stepping between Vesper and Elara. "I have the debt," Vesper whispered, leaning in close to Silas. "The Vane Group was built on the blood of the East End long before you reformed it. I have the ledgers your mother tried to hide, the ones that prove your father wasn't just a victim. He was a partner, Silas, until he grew a conscience and the Sterlings had to silence them both." Silas's jaw tightened so hard a muscle pulsed in his temple. That's a lie. Is it? Why do you think he took me in? Out of charity? No, it was hush money in the form of a daughter. Vesper turned to Elara, her blue eyes gleaming with a manic light. Be careful, little architect. You're building on a foundation of bones, and when I pull the thread, Silas's precious legacy will fall faster than the Sterling Tower. Vesper walked toward the door, pausing only to look back at the digital map of the city still glowing on the wall. Oakhaven doesn't want a savior, Silas. It wants a master. And if you won't be the demon they need, I'll gladly take the horns. She vanished into the hallway, leaving a scent of cold ozone and expensive cigarettes. The silence that followed was deafening. Elara looked at Silas, expecting him to roar, to call the guards, to initiate another audit. But he just stood there, staring at the empty doorway, his face pale in the moonlight. Silas, Elara whispered, reaching for his hand. He flinched. It was a small movement, but it felt like a gunshot. He looked at her, and for the first time since the gala, Elara saw a flicker of the old fear in his eyes. She has the ledgers, Elara, he said, his voice hollow. The ones my mother never let me see. She's lying, Silas. She's trying to break you. Vesper doesn't lie, Silas murmured, walking to the window to watch the silver Jaguar pull away from the curb. She just tells the truths that hurt the most. Elara looked at the beautiful, new building around them. The vocational centre, the library, the clinic, everything they had fought for. She realized then that the war with the Sterlings was just the prologue. The true battle for Oakhaven's soul and Silas's heart was coming from within the house of Vane itself. The foundations aren't just clay and concrete, are they? Elara asked softly. Silas didn't turn around. No, they're secrets, and Vesper just found the shovel. The silence in the vocational centre was no longer the peaceful quiet of a building at rest. It was the suffocating stillness of a tomb. After Vesper's departure, Silas had retreated into a shell of icy detachment. He had moved back to Cloud Peak Manor, locking himself in the north study, surrounded by the glow of monitors that no longer brought him the comfort of control. Elara stood in the centre of the dark library, the moonlight casting long, skeletal shadows across the rows of new books. She could still smell Vesper's perfume, ozone, and ash. She wants you to doubt the soil you stand on, Jack said, appearing from the shadows of the carpentry wing. He was holding a heavy iron flashlight, his face uncharacteristically grim. I saw her car. I know that silver feline. That woman is trouble wrapped in silk. She claims Silas's father was a partner in the collapse, Jax, Elara said, her voice trembling. She says there are ledgers. If that's true, this building. Silas's entire life, it's built on a lie. Jax spat on the floor. Names don't matter to me, Elara. Bricks do. But if you want to know the truth, you won't find it in those computers upstairs. Silas is a digital king, but his father, Carmine Vane, was a man of paper and ink. Where would he keep them? Silas said he searched everything. Not everything, Jax murmured, beckoning her to follow. There's an old archives vault beneath the Oakhaven foundry. It was boarded up after the fire. Silas thinks it was destroyed, but the foundry has a sub-basement reinforced with lead. My grandfather used to run security there. He told me the Vanes never threw anything away. They just buried it deeper. The Oakhaven foundry was a hollowed-out ribcage of rusted steel and scorched brick, a monument to Arthur Sterling's failed arson. The air inside was freezing, thick with the smell of wet soot and decay. Elara followed Jax down a narrow, treacherous staircase that groaned under their weight. They reached a heavy steel door, half submerged in stagnant water. Jax used a crowbar, the screech of metal on metal echoing like a dying scream through the empty factory. This is as far as I go, Jax whispered, handed her the flashlight. "I don't like the smell of old ghosts. I'll wait at the top. If you aren't up in 20 minutes, I'm calling the cavalry." Elara stepped into the vault. It was a small, circular room lined with filing cabinets that looked like rows of teeth. The air was stale, frozen in 1999. She began to search, her fingers numbing as she flipped through damp folders. Most were mundane: shipping receipts, payroll for the docks, architectural contracts. Then she saw it. A black leather ledger, tucked behind a false panel in the back of a drawer marked Project Sanctuary. Her breath hitched. She opened it. The entries were in Carmine Vane's steady, rhythmic hand. But as she turned the pages, the numbers began to shift. There were large deposits from the Sterling Trust, dated weeks before the housing collapse. Next to them were annotations in a different color: red ink. "Arthur demands the switch to Grade B steel. My wife refuses. He offers 10% of the port revenue. To accept is to sign a death warrant for the residents. To refuse is to sign one for my family. I have hidden the true logs in the foundation of the West Wing. May God forgive me for the middle path." Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. Carmine hadn't been a willing partner. He had been a man being extorted, trying to play a double game to save his wife's integrity while keeping his family alive. But there was one final entry, dated the day of the collapse. "Vesper's father, Julian, knows I have the evidence. He has moved the detonators. I am going to the site to stop her. If I do not return, Silas must never know how close I came to the rot. Let him believe I was only a victim. The burden of this truth would kill a child." "It wasn't a partnership," Elara whispered to the empty room. "It was a failed rescue." "A touching sentiment," a voice purred from the doorway. Elara spun around. Vesper Vane stood there, leaning against the rusted doorframe, a small, elegant handgun held loosely in her hand. Behind her stood two men Elara didn't recognize, mercenaries with the cold eyes of professional killers. "I see you found the Middle Path ledger," Vesper said, walking into the room. Her white suit looked blindingly bright in the gloom of the vault. "Carmine was a poet. It's a shame he was such a terrible businessman. He thought he could outmaneuver Arthur Sterling. He ended up as a bloodstain instead." "He was trying to save his wife," Elara shouted, clutching the ledger to her chest. "He didn't take the money." "The bank records say otherwise," Vesper smiled, reaching out a gloved hand. "And in Oakhaven, the records are the only thing that matters. Give it to me, Elara. I need that book to finish what the Sterling started. I'm going to liquidate the Vane Group, and I'm going to use Silas's own money to rebuild the docks under my name." "Silas will kill you." "Silas is paralyzed by his own nobility," Vesper laughed. "He's too busy mourning the saintly parents he never really knew. Once I show the city council these partnership entries, his legal aid office will be the first thing the DA shuts down. Now, the book." Elara looked at the filing cabinets, then at the heavy iron flashlight in her hand. She realized that she was no longer the girl who needed to be rescued. She was the one who held the foundations. "You want the truth, Vesper?" Elara asked, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. "The truth is that you're just like Adrian. You're a parasite who can't build anything, so you try to steal the shadows of the people who can." Elara didn't hand over the book. Instead, she swung the heavy flashlight, shattering the overhead light bulb. The vault plunged into absolute darkness. Vesper's men cursed, the sounds of their fumbling echoing in the small space. Elara dropped to her knees, crawling towards the back of the vault, where she had seen a narrow ventilation grate. She didn't head for the door. She headed for the bones of the building. "Find her!" Vesper screamed, her voice losing its silk and turning into a jagged edge. "Don't let her leave with that ledger." Elara felt the cold metal of the grate. She used the drafting compass from her pocket to unscrew the rusted bolts. a trick Silas had taught her during their nights in the manor. She slid inside the narrow shaft, just as a gunshot echoed through the vault, the bullet sparks flying off the filing cabinet inches from her feet. She scrambled through the dust, the ledger tucked into her jacket. She could hear them behind her, but she knew this foundry better than they did. She had studied the 1920s blueprints for the original vocational center site. She emerged into a hidden maintenance corridor that led towards the river. She ran, her lungs burning, the cold night air of Oakhaven hitting her face like a slap. Jax was waiting at the riverbank, his SUV idling in the shadows. "Elara, what happened? I heard shots." "Drive," she gasped, diving into the passenger seat. "Get me to the tower, now!" As the SUV roared away, Elara looked back at the foundry. Vesper was standing on the loading dock, her white suit a pale ghost against the dark brick. She wasn't chasing them. She was standing perfectly still, her phone to her ear. "Silas isn't the only one who can play the audit game," Elara whispered, gripping the leather book. She opened the ledger to the last page. There was a small dried flower pressed into the binding, a jasmine petal. Underneath it, in a shaky hand, was one final note. "For Silas. Build the sanctuary I couldn't. The truth is the only stone that doesn't crumble." Elara realized then that the war wasn't about ledgers or money. It was about which version of the past would win. And as the Vane Tower came into view, glowing like a beacon over the city, she knew she had the one thing Vesper could never understand. She had the cornerstone. The lobby of the Vane Empire Tower, once a sanctuary of marble and order, was a scene of clinical chaos. As Jax's SUV screeched to a halt at the curb, Elara saw the flickering blue and red lights of a dozen police cruisers reflecting off the glass facade. Officers in tactical gear stood at the revolving doors, and the public was being pushed back by a yellow line of tape that felt like a scar across her territory. Elara clutched the leather ledger to her chest, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. She pushed through the crowd, her face pale and streaked with the soot of the foundry. "Let me through! I'm the chief architect," she shouted at a stern-faced officer blocking the entrance. "Building's on lockdown, miss. Federal investigation," the officer replied, his hand resting on his belt. "I don't care if it's the White House. Silas Vane is in there." "Silas Vane is in custody, ma'am. He's being transported for questioning." The world tilted. Elara felt the weight of the air crush her lungs. She looked up and saw Silas. He was being led through the lobby, his hands cuffed behind his back. He wasn't struggling. He walked with that same terrifying, regal composure, but his eyes were fixed on the floor. Beside him was a man in a trench coat, Detective Miller, a veteran cop whose brother had been a guard killed during a Vane-led dock raid years ago. Miller wasn't just doing his job. He was enjoying it. As Silas reached the glass doors, he looked up. His eyes found Elara's. For a split second, the mask of the demon slipped, revealing a raw, agonizing plea. "Run." But Elara didn't run. She stood her ground until the cruiser door slammed shut and the sirens wailed, carrying Silas into the heart of the city's legal machinery. "Vesper moved faster than we thought," Calum said, his voice coming through a secure intercom. Elara was standing in Silas's north study. She had bypassed the police lockdown using a service crawl space she had designed into the tower's ventilation system, a secret only she and Silas knew. Calum was still in his holding cell in the sub-basement. The police hadn't found him yet because his cell was shielded against thermal and electronic scans. She didn't just leak the ledgers, Calum. She fabricated a digital trail that links Silas to a recent money laundering scheme involving the Vocational Center's construction funds, Elara said, spreading Carmine Vane's original ledger on the desk. "She's making it look like Silas was never protecting the East End, that he was just using it as a tax haven, just like Arthur did." Miller will break him, Calem's voice crackled. He's been waiting 10 years to get Silas in an interrogation room without lawyers. If Silas loses his temper, Miller will have enough to hold him indefinitely. You need to lead the board, Elara. You're the only one left with signing authority. The board won't listen to an architect. They'll listen to the person who holds the Vane seal. It's in the safe behind the portrait of his mother. The code is your birthday, Elara. He changed it the day you moved in. Elara froze. She looked at the portrait, the elegant woman with the drafting tools. She entered the numbers, her fingers trembling. The safe clicked open. Inside sat a heavy gold signet ring and a flash drive labelled The Bridge. The Vane Group boardroom was a theatre of sharks. 12 men and women in charcoal suits sat around a glass table, their faces masks of corporate anxiety. "The stock is in free fall," one director shouted. "We need to distance ourselves from Silas immediately. Vesper Vane has offered to step in as interim CEO. She has the family name and the support of the sterling creditors." "Vesper Vane is a thief." Elara's voice cut through the room like a cold blade. She stepped into the light, the charcoal blazer she had worn to the opening now torn and dusty, but her posture was unbreakable. She threw the leather ledger onto the center of the glass table. "That is the original record of the 1999 collapse. It proves that Carmine Vane was murdered for trying to stop the Sterlings, and this," she held up the gold signet ring, "is the authority of the Vane Group. Silas Vane did not launder money. He spent his personal fortune to build a sanctuary for a neighborhood your partners destroyed." "You're an employee, Miss Thorne," a woman at the end of the table sneered. "A mistress, at best. You have no standing here." "I am the lead architect of the project that currently holds 40% of this company's liquid assets in trust," Elara retorted. "If you vote for Vesper, I trigger the community trust clause I wrote into the contract. The land, the building, and the funding revert to Jack's and the East End residents. You'll be left with a pile of debt and a riot on your front door." The room went silent. The sharks realized they had been outmaneuvered by a woman who understood the bones of a contract, as well as she understood the bones of a building. "What do you want?" the chairman asked. 48 hours, Elara said. "I'm going to the precinct. I'm going to show the DA that the digital evidence was planted. And you are going to keep the gates locked against Vesper. If she so much as breathes on this glass, you call me." Inside the interrogation room at the 4th precinct, the air was stagnant, smelling of burnt coffee and old sweat. Silas sat beneath a single, buzzing fluorescent light. Detective Miller leaned over him, his face inches from Silas's. "Your father was a coward, Silas. He took the money and then tried to play hero. And you? You're just a more expensive version of him. Tell me about the East End funds. Tell me how much you kicked back to Jack's to keep the streets quiet." Silas didn't speak. He stared at the scratched metal of the table, his mind a fortress under siege. He could feel the rage, the old demon, clawing at the back of his throat. He wanted to reach across the table and break Miller's jaw. He wanted to burn the city down. "Nothing to say? Fine, we're moving to the formal indictment. Your little architect friend? She's next. We have a warrant out for her as an accessory." Silas's head snapped up. His eyes flashed with a lethal, silver fire. "If you touch her, Miller, there isn't a cell in this country that will keep you safe from me." "There he is," Miller grinned, tapping his recorder. "The demon. I knew he was in there somewhere." The door to the interrogation room burst open. A young officer looked panicked. "Sir, the district attorney is here, and he's not alone. He's with—" "Well, you should see for yourself." Miller stomped out, leaving Silas alone in the dark. A moment later, the heavy steel door opened again. But it wasn't the DA. Elara stepped in. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red, but she was holding the black leather ledger and a stack of printed forensic reports. She walked to the table and sat across from Silas. "I found it," she whispered. "I found the middle path." Silas reached across the table, his cuffed hands trembling as he touched her fingers. "You shouldn't be here, Elara. Miller is looking for a reason to ruin you." Miller is currently being told by the DA that the server Vesper used to plant the evidence was registered to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, the same one that funded Arthur Sterling's lawyers, Elara said, a small, triumphant smile breaking through her fatigue. "The ledger proves your father's innocence. The forensic report proves yours." Silas let out a long, ragged breath, his forehead dropping to rest against their joined hands. "You saved me again." "No," Elara said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "We saved the Foundation. Vesper is on the run, Silas, but she's not done. She didn't go to the docks. She's headed for the East End. She's going to burn the center." Silas stood up, his eyes turning cold and focused once more. The officer entered with a key, unlocking the handcuffs. Silas didn't wait for an apology from Miller, who stood in the hallway looking like he'd swallowed glass. Silas grabbed his blazer and looked at Elara. "Jax is there. He'll hold the perimeter, but Vesper knows the structural weak points. She helped design the original demolition plan for the Sterlings." "I know where she'll go," Elara said, her mind already visualizing the blueprints. "The gas mains beneath the library. If she hits the pressure valve, the whole building goes up." As they ran toward the exit, the city of Oakhaven looked different, darker, more volatile. The house of cards had fallen, but the fire was just beginning. The drive to the East End was a blur of sirenless speed. Silas drove his personal SUV, a rugged, blacked-out vehicle that Calum had modified for combat, while Elara sat beside him, the digital blueprints of the vocational center glowing on her tablet. Oakhaven's nighttime skyline, dominated by the skeletal remains of the Sterling Tower, seemed to watch them with 1,000 indifferent eyes. But ahead in the East End, a different kind of light was blooming, a sickly orange glow that signaled fire. "Jax is on site, but he's pinned down by sniper fire from the adjacent tenement," Silas said, his voice clipped and tight as he expertly navigated the narrow streets. "Vesper hired specialized mercenaries this time, professional arsonists, not Sterling thugs." "She's already breached the basement," Elara said, her finger tracing a blinking red dot on the schematic. "She tripped the pressure sensor on the main gas line 2 minutes ago. The automated system failed. She must have cut the override cables." Silas didn't swear. He just pressed the accelerator harder. The vocational center was his mother's finished legacy, his father's redemption, and the only place that now held his soul. He would not let it burn. They reached the perimeter. Jax's men were trading fire with Vesper's mercenaries across the debris-strewn street. The air was thick with smoke, and the heat was already rising. Silas parked the SUV behind a concrete retaining wall. He looked at Elara, his eyes a dangerous molten grey in the firelight. "I'm going to draw the sniper fire. Calum is still locked up, so I have to be the distraction. You need to get to the library basement. The gas main is behind the reinforced archival vault." "I know," Elara said, checking the small toolkit she had snatched from her studio. "I have the manual override key." "This isn't a blueprint, Elara. The building is a living weapon now. Be careful. And if Vesper is there—" He reached into his ankle holster and pulled out a small, silenced pistol. He placed it in her hand. "Use it." Elara looked at the weapon, its weight heavy with the finality of their situation. She nodded, tucked it into her canvas jacket, and slipped into the shadows. Elara moved through the building with the fluidity of water. She knew every structural rib, every ventilation shaft, and every weak point Vesper might exploit. The center was groaning, the sound of concrete expanding under immense heat echoing through the halls. She reached the library wing. Smoke was beginning to seep through the floorboards. She descended into the basement, her flashlight cutting through the thick, acrid haze. The basement was a labyrinth of shadows, much like the one under the foundry where she had faced Adrian. But this one smelled of fresh cement and paint, new beginnings waiting to be extinguished. She reached the gas main. The heavy iron wheel was locked in the open position, the digital control panel above it shattered and leaking sparks. A timer was counting down on the wall. 4 minutes. Elara pulled the manual override key from her kit, but as she stepped forward, a white silk figure stepped from behind the concrete pillar. "You really should have taken the middle path, little architect," Vesper Vane sighed, leaning against the main pressure tank, a remote detonator held loosely in her hand. "You've made this so difficult for yourself." Vesper looked worse for wear. Her white suit was stained with soot and her platinum hair was disheveled, but her blue eyes still burned with a manic, icy light. "It's over, Vesper," Elara said, keeping her voice steady. "Silas's audit worked. Arthur and Adrian are in custody. The police know you planted the evidence." "Arthur was a dinosaur," Vesper scoffed, pushing off the tank. "His downfall was inevitable. But you've infected Silas with this sentimentality, this absurd belief that you can build something good in a city that only respects power." Vesper raised the detonator. "I cut the automated system, but I also rigged the ventilation shafts with secondary incendiary charges. If you turn that wheel, I press this button. The library will become a furnace. You and the books will burn first, and then the whole structure will collapse into its own footprint." "You'd burn the legacy of the man who raised you?" Elara demanded, subtly inching her hand toward the hidden pistol. "Carmine Vane raised me to understand the price of Oakhaven," Vesper retorted, walking a slow semicircle around Elara. "He used a daughter to pay a debt, and I'm just collecting interest. My father dies in the Sterling collapse, and I'm expected to play grateful ward to his killer's son? No, I'm going to burn the Vane name down, and from its ashes, I'll build my own." 2:30 minutes. Elara looked at the timer, then at Vesper. She saw the same madness she had seen in Adrian, but Vesper's was colder, more patient. She realized she couldn't out-talk her, and she couldn't out-fight her. She had to out-design her. "You spent 20 years studying this family, Vesper. You learned Silas's weaknesses, his routines. You even learned his mother's style." Elara took a step back, drawing Vesper away from the pressure valve. "But you didn't learn the building." Vesper paused, her smile faltering slightly. "What are you talking about?" "You think the library basement is the weakest point? It's the strongest. The concrete here is mixed with fiber reinforcement to protect the archives from a structural collapse." Elara pointed to the ventilation grate above Vesper's head. "But you didn't check the airflow dynamics. This building has a passive cooling system. It draws air from the roof. Your incendiary charges in the shafts aren't vents, Vesper. They're chimneys. If you ignite them, the fire won't burn down. It will draw all the oxygen from the library upstairs, and then it will extinguish itself." Vesper froze. For a split second, doubt flickered in her piercing blue eyes. Her father might have been an architect of shadow, but Elara was a master of structure. "You're lying," Vesper hissed, her hand tightening around the detonator. "Press it," Elara challenged. "See what happens to your furnace." 1:30 minutes. Vesper screamed, a sound of raw, unhinged fury, and pressed the button. A deep, thudding explosion echoed from the upper floors. The building groaned, but instead of a ball of fire, there was a muffled roar, like a dragon drawing breath. Thick, black smoke suddenly billowed out of the ventilation grate, filling the basement. Vesper's plan had failed. The passive cooling system had done exactly what Elara predicted. The updraft had choked the flames. "No!" Vesper shrieked, coughing in the smoke. She raised her handgun, aiming wildly at Elara. Elara didn't hesitate. She drew the silenced pistol from her jacket, aimed for the concrete floor just in front of Vesper's feet, and fired. The bullet ricocheted, sending a shard of concrete flying into Vesper's arm. Vesper dropped her weapon with a scream, the remote detonator skittering across the floor. Elara lunged for the gas main. She inserted the manual override key and, using every ounce of strength she had, began to turn the heavy iron wheel. The mechanism groaned, resistant to change, but Elara pushed back. She wasn't just turning a wheel, she was closing a chapter of Oakhaven's history. 0:30 minutes. The mechanical clunk of the gas valve shutting resonated through the basement. The timer on the wall froze at 0:15. The gas mains were sealed. The center was safe from a total explosion. Elara looked around for Vesper, her heart pounding. The smoke was still thick, but the white suit was gone. Vesper had used the confusion to flee through the service tunnel. Suddenly, Silas was there, his tactical gear torn, his face covered in soot. He took in the frozen timer, the manual override key, and the blood on the floor. "You did it," he breathed, the word a mix of relief and awe. "I shut off the main," Elara gasped, leaning against the cold concrete. "But Vesper set secondary fires in the upper floors. They'll need a fire crew, but they won't explode. Jax has his men setting a water brigade. Miller has arrived with the federal marshals. Vesper's mercenaries are surrendering." Silas walked over to her, his hand cupping her face. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine. But Vesper—" She got away. She went through the service tunnel toward the river. Silas didn't look angry. He looked toward the tunnel, then back at the beautiful, smoky library above them. "Let her run. Vesper Vane's Oakhaven is gone. Her father's name is a footnote in a sterling DA case. She has nowhere left to build." He pulled Elara into his arms, their soot-stained clothing clashing as he held her with a desperate, honest intensity. Outside, the sirens of 1,000 fire engines were finally arriving. But inside the concrete heart of the East End, Silas and Elara had just proven that some foundations could survive any amount of blood in the bricks. The sky over the East End was no longer ablaze with the fire of explosives, but radiant with the glare of rescue lights and a newly blossomed hope. Amidst the shattered rubble of the library, a place that had nearly become a tomb for them all, Silas and Elara stood, faces smeared with coal dust, but eyes burning with light. Silas pulled Elara tightly against him, his breathing heavy, his chest heaving after the life and death struggle. He spoke no words, simply burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the faint scent of jasmine that still clung defiantly to her skin amidst the stench of gunpowder. Elara gently stroked Silas's broad back. She knew that from the moment she had shut off that final pressure valve, she was no longer a possession under his protection. She was his partner, the architect of his new life. "It's over, Silas," she whispered. "The House of Sterling has fallen." Silas raised his head, locking eyes with her. He pressed a searing kiss to her forehead, no longer the cold, contractual kiss of that first gala night, but a kiss of salvation. "Not yet, Elara," Silas said, looking toward the distant horizon where dark clouds were beginning to gather. "This is only the beginning of the foundation. We still have an entire city to rebuild." Beneath the flashing cameras of the press and the roaring cheers of the East End residents, they did not know that 1,000 miles away, another clock had already begun to tick down. London, Tower Bridge shrouded in a thick, spectral fog. Through the freezing rain of the fog city, A luxurious silver Jaguar glided as silently as a ghost. The window lowered, revealing a face beautiful to the point of cruelty. Vesper Vane looked down at a photograph of Silas and Elara's happiness splashed across an international newspaper. She curled her lips slightly, her blood-red lipstick a sharp contrast to her icy platinum blonde hair. "Silas, my dearest little brother," Vesper's voice rang out, sharp and dripping with chilling mockery. "Did you really think you'd found paradise in that Oakhaven rat hole? Did you think your little architect could patch up the cracks in your soul?" Vesper lit a cigarette, the white smoke vanishing into the London rain. She flipped through a dossier, revealing the secret 1999 blueprints of Silas's father, designs written in ink the color of dried blood. "Your foundation isn't made of steel, Silas. It's made of our father's lies." She turned to the towering man waiting in the shadows, Victor Volkov. "Prepare the plane, Victor. It's time to put Silas's angel in real shackles." Elara's journey of rebellion and revenge against her terrible ex-boyfriend ends here. Let's look forward to part 2 of the story with the appearance of Vesper and the Blackwood Corporation. A battle for survival of the empire that Silas and Elara will have to face.